the papers that we read from our first assignment. The experiment was designed in order to test memory performance for semantic items, and the specific memory paradigm, also used in Webner et al. Experiment. So the SM paradigm is aimed to uncover brain mechanisms which are associated with mnemonic activity during encoding. So in the specific memory paradigm, you take the participants' neural activity measures, and you're classifying the activity according to their performances during the retrieval phase. However, and that's the reason I asked for this presentation, the vast majority of specific memory studies probe memory with recognition, okay, with recognition tests, and like Webner et al. And my question was, is a successful encoding process for semantic items similar for all tasks, for recognition tasks and recall tasks as well, or might there be a difference in the successful recoding in different tasks? Okay, so that's what we're going to check. Is recognition like recall? So recognition is mediated by two processes, familiarity and recollection. Familiarity is an automatic process which is associated with the fluency in which an item is processed. And recollection is a conscious process which involves the restatement of the memory trace within its context. So a widespread view was that recollection is a recall-like process. Okay, because they saw the active search of the memory trace in the recollection as recall. So an underlying assumption for this view is that this active search is similar, if not identical, for recollection and for recall. Okay, so up until 2012, three studies were aimed to test differences to compare a successful encoding for items, semantic items could be later on recalled, and items could be later on only recognized and not recalled. So this one of the three from Seresnia and Davachi, and you can see a greater SM effect for items that could be later on recalled. The greater SM effect, the second memory effect, is in terms of magnitude of activation during the encoding process. In blue, it's the item that could be recalled, the activity during the encoding, and the red and the green is stands for different recognition tests. However, both this study and the other two aim to test differences between successful encoding of semantic items. It could be recalled or only recognized. We saw the difference as the recall process requiring more processing. So we're going to see that it's not this way. Could be the other way around too. Before that, the subdivisions of the medial temporal lobe have seen great interest during the last decade, with data implicated in the parahippocampal cortex in contextual processing, the perirhinal cortex in item processing, and the hippocampus in item context binding. So in 2012, two studies from the same lab, from Sadeh et al. Lab, aimed to compare both the retrieval process and the encoding process between items that could be later on recalled, then the semantic items could be later on only recognized. So really in short, during the encoding phase, they had.
I just wanted to make sure because you keep saying recall. So when the task is recall, you're not showed anything, and you're just asked what do you remember, and you have to recall without seeing anything. And when recognize means I show you two things, and you have to recognize which one you saw and which one you didn't.
Actually, you have different designs for each same category, and by that eliminating the similarity component recognition. And here in the recall you have just the keyword, and the target word is not here. It's just four words that are four semantic items that are unrelevant to it. It just they were instructed to recall the word that was associated with the book in that case. Okay. I don't have time to explain the methods they use, but jumping to the results. For the encoding experiment, the recollection larger than recall contrast revealed a large class of activation in the right parahippocampal cortex and the posterior hippocampus. The parahippocampal cortex, if you remember from 2 slides or 3 slides ago, is associated with contextual processing, and this might suggest that recognition relies more on contextual processing during the encoding than does the recall. Okay, from another result is that for recall larger than recognition contrast reveal a larger subsequent memory effect in left inferior prefrontal cortex, and the inferior prefrontal cortex was suggested to have a role in item information processing during the encoding, and this might suggest that during the encoding the item information processing has a much larger impact on items to be later on recalled than items to be later on recognized. I'm going real quickly on the retrieval part because it's not what we want to have, but it's really interesting. So they have 6 volumes of interest. Each volume here stands for both connectivity and direction of connectivity between the subdivisions of the medial temporal lobe, the parahippocampal cortex, the parietal cortex, and the hippocampus. And
they're interested volumes, you mean anatomical volumes, right?
yeah, they have like it was very difficult doing, and you can have criticizing regarding the techniques they use, but you have like specific path for the direction between the parahippocampal cortex and the hippocampus, and another one from the hippocampus to the parahippocampal cortex in that example. Actually, they had the distance between the two was 6 millimeters, and the radius of each one was 5. So you can have your criticisms regarding that analysis, but they actually used other methods as well. And what they find out is pattern of interaction between memory test and the input to the hippocampus. For the recall, the retrieval process was initiated by the parahippocampal cortex, which is associated with the contextual processing. This triggered activity in the hippocampus, and the hippocampal activity triggered activity in the parietal cortex. And the reverse pattern was found for recognition when item information processing initiated the retrieval process in the parietal cortex. This triggered activity in the hippocampus, and this whole process ends with the retrieval of contextual information from the parahippocampal cortex. So this might suggest that you have different patterns of activation which are task dependent during the retrieval. And going to the last slide. So the differential roles of contextual processing in recall and recognition. We saw that the contextual processing is significant during the retrieval, both for recall and recognition. As we saw that the activity of the parahippocampal cortex, which is associated with contextual processing, is strong both during the recall and the recognition test. However, the contextual processing during encoding seems more crucial for being able to differentiate between the target and the foils during the recognition than to initiate the retrieval process in recall. Those results suggested associated encoding mechanism supports recollection-based recognition and recall, and this argue with the widespread view that the recollection-based recognition is a recall-like process, and that's what I want to show you.
Can I ask?
Yeah, if it's okay with Marab.
Yeah. So, okay. Now, so can you just explain? So, you said there are two different things, right? So there's one thing that's happening while you're encoding, and one thing that's happening
Yes.
while you're retrieving. And so can you just explain that again? What's happening? What the differences are on each phase and how they relate to behavior?
Okay. Okay. So the thing is, it's easier actually to start with the retrieval. Okay, I think. During the retrieval, when you have to recall something, you have, for example, in this experiment, you had only the cue, right? The cue word. So you start with some kind of contextual information in the this is a suggested plot, but you start with the contextual information, and then you retrieve an item information. The item in that case was the onion, for example, and not the onion, the what, I don't know, book, for example. Okay, the status word that you cannot see. In the recognition, you do see the two words. You see all of the words. You see also the pause. Okay, so you start with an item. Okay, the parietal cortex is associated with item information processing. You start with that, and then you get after the activation and everything, you get the context. Because you need the context in order to be able to differentiate between the starters and the folders. Here you start with an item, and you get contextual information. Here you start with contextual information, and you get the item. This is for the retrieval. For the encoding process, the contextual processing is more important during the encoding of items you could later on recognize, okay? And the item processing is more important for items that you could later on recall during the encoding.
So you're making assumptions
Well,
about
I mean, thank you for this initiative. You're very welcome to discuss it during the very short break that we'll have. But otherwise, we're going to be spilled into the next lesson and we have this problem. So many thanks to you all for this initiative. And you're very welcome to discuss it. Not during the class, sorry. Actually, we're now getting to what we planned initially to do in this class. And this is invite Omri, to talk about language acquisition. You must know the difference between recall and recognition and so Omri is a very recent faculty who has a split position between cognition and computer science. And Omri studied cognition here as a first degree, cognition cognitive sciences, and did his PhD with Ari Rappaport on language acquisition. No.
Semantic representation, statistical learning of semantic representation.
And I asked Omri to give a guest lecture, and I'm very happy that Omri agreed. So we'll have Omri give a talk about his work in its broader context, because we know very little for now about language acquisition. I think Omri represents the other school compared to that of Yossi Brzezinski.
Yes, perhaps not the other end, but
not the other end, but it's kind of an alternative view about language acquisition. So they have a very good general background, because most of them, if not all of them, of learning and representation, but this will be the first one. So, thanks very much.
Thanks. So it's 60 minutes then, or is there a break? Or how is it?
It's complicated, because I think there should be a break, but I don't know how, do you want to make a break? Do you prefer a 10-minute break in between? You
Okay.
know that you're supposed to say no, and you have to say, but.
Yes, but the meeting is not.
You prefer a cigar or please?
I'm happy to go straight.
Okay,
If
we'll go
that's
straight,
fine.
then we'll see if we need 5 minutes break before the presentation of the Mama.
Okay, thank you. So this specific work that I'm going to present, or at least the talk will focus on, is actually something that I did in my postdoc with several people listed here from Edinburgh, actually from the University of Edinburgh. And yeah, so let me start with a bit about computational models in linguistics. I'm sure that you do have some background in computational modeling, or you've at least heard this kind of approaches to cognition. And yes, and computational models are also quite frequently used in linguistics to study language. And they have the usual or perhaps the well-known advantages of being explicit, and we'll see the importance of that in a minute. Being transparent, you see exactly, you can look in exactly and see how the computation is conducted. They're very easy to evaluate usually because you have control over the input, over much of the setting. So this all makes it very very attractive. On the other hand, we should bear in mind that computational models are not baby learning language. That's for sure. So we'll try and and be careful about what we can infer from this experimentation on the study of language acquisition. So, but please ask me about that if something is not clear. Ideally, we'd like computational models to make predictions that are bold conjectures, if you will, that can later on be, that we never thought of before, but could later on be verified. And I'm not sure that we're quite there yet in computational models of linguistics. I know that in other fields it is the case, but this is certainly the idea. But let's see what we already can do with computational models. So, for instance, we can suggest explicit algorithms that are able to incorporate information of several kinds into one model, or to conduct one task. And this will actually be the point of this talk. There's also a question of learnability, which is a big question in language. And as you say, you have background from Yossi's talk, I'm sure he mentioned it. There is a lot of contention in linguistics about what kind of biases, what kind of input is needed in order to reach certain generalization, and this relates to the question of innateness and the domain generality of the learning algorithms, or domain specificity. So all of these questions are more of an information theoretic question, if you will, right? What kind of information can be inferred in principle, by an ideal learner from a certain type of information, right? So it's clear that for these kind of questions, computational models are kind of ideal. You can control the setting very well. And yes, and of course there's also questions about, looking whether certain assumptions make it easier or harder to conduct a certain task. So all of these have been addressed using computational models. Specifically, what we'll be talking about is a specific question related to language acquisition. And the question is as follows. So, we know that children learn language, and they can learn any language that they're exposed to, or sufficiently exposed to. But languages differ in many ways. For instance, languages differ in terms of their vocabulary. So usually it is not the same word that's used across different languages to describe the same thing. And the grammar can be quite different. So in the simple example, even, in Hebrew, yes, most of you at least can know Hebrew. Well, then the noun comes before the adjective, and in English it's the other way around. So for instance, you have these kind of differences. But so children hearing, say, kubiyaduma or red cube, or hearing enough language, they are able to infer that red cube means kubiyaduma in Hebrew, but they also manage to infer that that adjectives come before the noun in Hebrew or come before, and that in English, sorry, and that it's the other way around in Hebrew, right? So essentially we have two questions here. If they knew the word, it's pretty clear how they would infer the grammatical generalization. If they knew that red is an adjective and cube is a noun, that they would know that adjectives come before nouns. And if they knew the rules of grammar, right, then they could infer perhaps what the rules mean, or what the words mean, but they don't know either. So these two questions are linked to one another. They inform one another, but still it's not completely clear how you start. You see where I'm getting? Yes.
By comparing Hebrew and English, are you specifically talking about when they learn two languages, or situations
No.
that they're comparing, or this is when you're learning in one language? Just an example of.
Yes, just an example saying that we can't assume that the child, perhaps
Knows
knows
one.
innately that adjectives come before nouns, because that's what I meant. Yes, thank you. Okay. So even when the words are unknown, we know from experiments with children that children can use their knowledge of language, of grammar, even with words that they haven't encountered before, given that they've already learned something. We'll talk about that later on, right? So there is a notion in which they learn grammar, and they certainly learn words. But how do they, if you will, how do they manage to link between the specific words and, or between the concept and the words, given that they don't know the grammar? That's called the linkage problem sometimes. Okay, so as I said, the word learning and grammar learning are coupled, and they could benefit from being jointly modeled, and in general, we know that children somehow manage to do both. So it is interesting to look at the interactions between the two. So how can computational models help? Perhaps before that, let's look at one specific hypothesis about how this is done. Okay, about how this is done. So that's called the semantic bootstrapping hypothesis, and essentially what it says is that children manage to learn language by enjoying access to some kind of structural representation of the intended semantics of the utterance. What does that mean? Well, ideally it means that children understand something. If they learn language in some context, they have shared attention with their caretaker, they see things, they get all sorts of information. Now that's on the one hand. So perhaps using this information in some obscure way, they can understand what's being told to them, at least some of the time, right? So perhaps the child doesn't know anything about Hebrew or English, but for instance, he does understand that now we're talking about this red cube here. Okay, and not only does he understand this, interpretation is, we can think about it as some kind of structured representation of meaning, okay, like a logical formula, if you will. That's the type of modeling we'll use here, but essentially it's structured. Okay, that's an important bit here. And then the grammar is acquired by finding generalization in this mapping between sound and semantic representations of meaning. Okay, that's a semantic bootstrapping hypothesis. Now, perhaps in the end, I don't know if you just don't know what to say now. Do you have some background on connectionist models of acquisition and all this distributional learning of categories? Okay, so there has been some modeling of language acquisition which looks only at if you will, the phonological input or the text, if you think about it as transcribed, and try to induce not from sentence meaning pairs, right, not from sentences which are glossed in some way, but just from the, if you will, the phonological input. We'll talk about them later on, but in very short, I can say that their performance is not convincing at all. So nobody has managed to show anything very convincing about them working, but we'll defer some discussion of them for later on. Here we assume that the child understands, very optimistically, we assume that the child understands what the caretaker says is what the adult is talking about. Okay. Now, for this to work, we need the semantics to be represented in a universal language of thought. okay, because we can't assume that the pre-linguistic child knows, has some specific language, he has the language of thought, okay, which is the structured representation. And this language of thought, in order for the child to understand, to acquire grammar, needs to represent all grammatically relevant distinctions, such as tense, agency, and so on, even if they're not expressed, if they're not explicitly expressed. What do I mean? So if the child, say, sees this, this is very schematic, okay, but indulge me here. If the child sees some football player kicking a ball, and this is recognizes him as John, then perhaps what the child is thinking, this is what I see, okay, now this is this is what I see, and this is what I hear. John ba'at bakador, which is John kicked the ball in Hebrew. Now what's important here, will be important later on, is that this representation has to be very expressive, because the child has to understand, has to make the grammatical generalization about, that there is what is the overt manifestation of a past tense or present tense, given that Hebrew, say, expresses this distinction, or the distinction between, perfect verbs that are expressed in perfect and imperfect. So for this mapping to be understood, of course, the representation has to, in some way, be expressive enough in order to express all those distinctions that, some in each specific language, some of which are expressed. Is that okay? So for instance, what I mean to say is that even if, say, Hebrew doesn't distinguish between kicked and have kicked, okay, then still, since some languages do, the child has to somehow, his representation of meaning has to be expressive enough in order to express this distinction as well. Okay, so this is kind of a universal language of thought. That's the assumption of the semantic bootstrapping hypothesis. Yes.
In a way, we shift the idea of innate grammar to very detailed innate semantics, right? Is it an easier assumption?
Yes, we'll review this assumption later on. I should say at this point that it's an assumption that I think the only assumption that actually has some merit of in terms of performance, so in terms of being at least able to in principle learn the type of generalizations that we see children learn. But of course, the type of this semantic representation is what makes this assumption very, very strong, and of course attracted a lot of criticism on it, as I'm sure that yes, you can think of several critiques that one can raise against it. So right, so we assume that the child has access to some language of thought. Nobody really knows how to specify it, and nobody ever nobody has access to it, and so on. This is a very, very strong assumption. The point is that it doesn't really have any competitors, it seems, to me at least, at the moment. So the other brand, which assumes that you just learn from the phonological input, from distributional regularities over the phonological input, simply nobody has managed to make it work. So, but we'll discuss later on. We'll review this assumption later on. I hope we'll have time for this. Good. Now, where's the difficulty here? We'll make this assumption, the semantic bootstrapping assumption, and if we assume it, everything works. So what is there? What is there left to do? Well, quite a bit, it seems, because it's still not clear, even if we make this very strong assumption, how does the child learn language? So let's even assume that the child understands what he hears. No, there is no explicit model. Nobody has suggested an explicit model for learning, from learning in this setting. In this setting, we'll define it formally in a moment. But even if we make this very strong assumption, and this is, it's still not clear how the algorithm uses this knowledge, how this mapping between sentences and semantic representation is induced. And in fact, perhaps I can send the link later. There is a recent paper in Language saying that this is in fact the case for essentially all the suggestions for language acquisition. So for instance, I guess you learned quite a bit on universal grammar, that's kind of UG, right, assumptions. Well, universal grammar assumptions usually are very underspecified as well in terms of how they're actually learned. So for instance, what a kind of principle and parameters suggestion would tell you, well, look, the child knows almost all the grammar aside from these few parameters, and then you can just look at sentences and figure out what these parameters are, right? Or like whether nouns come before adjectives or the other way around. Now, but how do children even know to begin with what are the nouns or the adjectives of this language? This is not clear also for these kind of more established approaches such as principles and parameters. So there's a question left to be answered here. Because without answering it, we're really not even sure whether making these very strong assumptions, such as the UG, the principle and parameters assumption, or the semantic bootstrapping hypothesis assumption, whether this actually helps, or in what way it helps. And here computational models are quite effective. So let's formulate the problem. The problem is as follows. Given input, which is available to the child, so say it is child-directed utterances, something that an adult or the caretaker told the child, paired with their logical forms, which is, we'll talk about it in a bit, but think about it just as kind of predicate logic formulas. Did all of you see formalization of natural language, like a basic logic course? Yes, okay. So think about it as kind of predicate logic formulas. So given that we have this kind of training input, we have sentences paired with their minimum presentations, we'd like to predict an logical form for unseen text. So for what kind of generalizations we would like to make? For instance, we would like to, so if we learned from some instances what doggies are, because we've somehow managed to figure out that this doggies here correspond to this doggies here, then we can use it in other contexts, say to parse sentences, that have taken doggies, and each of those we've seen separately, and now we can combine them together. Or we can even make we can make perhaps even stronger generalization, saying that, if we have an unseen word that appears in a certain context, then we can, for instance, infer that it's an imperative verb, say move here. So these kind of generalizations we'd like to make. So this is the learning problem. It's a formal learning problem. So more abstractly, we can say that the research goals are given assumptions on the nature of the mapping between utterances and the language of thought, okay, between strings and formulas, and given assumptions on the learning process, so how does statistical learning take place, and given assumptions on the input available to the child, we'd like to construct a statistical model for learning this mapping and generalizing to unseen text. That's the general research goal, and I'll present a model and some experiments on the English section of the Child's corpus. But what's important for me at this point is just to convey how, what's the learning task, what kind of framework we're talking about, and how can computational models tell us something. Okay, so in this context. So that's the point I was trying to make, so please ask me if this point is not clear, how computational models relate to these big questions on language acquisition. Okay, now the modeling approach is the modeling approach is as follows. We first note that this problem of, I don't know how much background you have in statistical learning theory, but this type of learning, this kind of learning setting is very difficult, right? Essentially, the point is that these have complicated structure. They're kind of nested logical formulas. They have combinatorically, they can be quite complicated if you think about long sentences. Eve or mom, I don't know, dad said that you should take the cookies away. They have quite a bit of structure, and statistical learning theory doesn't have these off-the-shelf solutions for this learning setting. Otherwise, there wouldn't be too much left to do. And essentially, what we'll do is we'll impose some structure. We'll see it in a moment, but we'll assume that there is some grammar. It will be a different grammar, perhaps, from the principles and parameters type of grammar that you've seen, and it will have also a statistical component. So it will be an algorithm that kind of takes insight from both formal grammar theory and statistical learning theory. Okay, so yeah, that's the outline, but I think I've talked about it enough. So let's give a little bit of background. How am I with the time? Okay, so let's give a little bit of background on the kind of methods that we're going to use in order to define the model. After which we'll move on to defining the actual model, and then at the last or before last, we'll discuss the experiments, and then we'll end with some discussion. For instance, reviewing the semantic bootstrapping hypothesis. Okay, so the type of meaning representation that we'll use for now is something very simple. So they'll look like essentially predicate logic. What they abstract away from, so if you have, Eve likes mommy, this is represented as, say, like applied over Eve and mommy. What this essentially abstracts over is the order of the words. Okay, so the same representation, say, would be used for languages which have, say, the verb final in position or verb initial position, and so on. And they also abstract away from the way from the way we'll see it later, from the way that from how should I say it? From the way that words are. Okay. What I'm saying is, if we assume that Eve likes mommy corresponds to like Eve mommy, this still does not mean that each word has to match a single logical item. We still entertain the case that, say, for instance, like Eve is together corresponds to one word. Okay, and this is important because some languages, for instance, don't. If you think about you like mommy, or I like mommy. That means in Hebrew you don't mention the I. In English explicitly. In English you do, right? Or something like that. Then it's important for the segmentation of the logical formulas into words not to be, not to be underspecified in the model. So the model will be able to entertain different possibilities. We'll see an example in a bit. We have lambda operators, for those of you who know them, in order to define functions. So for instance, this means like is a function that takes two arguments, x and y, and then applies like, predicate like over them. That's more of logic stuff. And each of them is also typed. So we have atomic types, entity, truth value, event, and composite types. So we can also say that the word doesn't match, is not, say, an entity, a truth value, an event, and so on, but, say, a function from say, pairs of entities to an event. So you can think of like, if you know a bit of logic, I guess this is standard. You can think of like as a function from two entities to, say, a truth value of whether these entities are in the relation like. Now, the syntax that we're going to use is called combinatorial categorial grammar, and I guess most of you have seen these kind of phrase structure grammars, right, where the syntactic position, the position of the word in the tree, is what determines its syntactic role, right? So the fact that prove is, say, a sibling of completeness means that completeness is an object of proof. If you've seen that, that's not the type of syntactic derivations we're going to use. We're going to use something slightly different, which is called combinatorial categorial grammar. And there, what determines the syntactic behavior of a word is a category, a lexical category. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that for combinatorial categorial grammar, what's important is, say, to define that Marcel is an NP, and to say completeness is an NP, a noun phrase, and that prove is something that if you give it an NP to its right and an NP to its left, it would turn into an S, into a sentence. So it's a kind of a way to, if you will, to project the trees onto the lexical items. Okay, so I won't talk, that would take a different class, but the point here is that the syntactic behavior is defined in the level of words. Okay, so for instance, proved here is an SVO verb, subject verb object verb, because it searches for its object to its right and the subject to its left. If it would have been a VSO verb, a verb subject object verb, then it would have syntactic category saying that it is looking for an object to its right and the subject to its right. Okay, and if it was verb final, then both of them would look for it in its left. Yes.
The reason you're not assuming just like naive statistical learning without any constraints is that it's just too complicated? I mean, like you said before.
The question
Why
is
assume?
what is the most naive, because it's just not. Okay, perhaps the very simple methods in statistical learning are usually kind of classification or clustering, right? Now, when you have, say, this is supervised, so say when you have a classification task, again, the vanilla algorithm, what they have is just say a finite set of labels without any structure, right? You see an image and you want to say whether this is a giraffe or a rhinoceros or a horse, say, okay? Now, what we're predicting here, given a sentence, is a formula. Okay, now there's an infinite number of formulas, right? Because chances are that I'll never see another. If I have a sentence meaning pair in my training data, I'll never see this label, this formula, ever again in the test group. So I somehow have to decompose. I somehow have to take my training data and to do something with it, because otherwise it's not even clear what generalizations I'll make. So I have, say, Eve likes doggies and take the cookies and more cookies. And then I have, take the doggies, but I've never seen take the doggies. I've never seen this string. Perhaps I've seen pieces of this string, but what do I know about pieces of this string? What should I match them? So it's just not clear what's the naive way of doing it. You can think about ways of doing it, but it's not really clear what's the naive way of doing it, just because you have a lot of structure on the set of labels that you're trying to map to. That's the. Now there are connectionist approaches that say that I don't know if they're naive, but they take they take algorithms that are very domain general, right, in a sense. You just map everything to some vector, you put it in your neural network, and then, you train it, and yes, and then maybe it works. And it would be great, perhaps, if it did work. There's a lot to say about neural networks, but the point is that at least for these kind of problems, or even simpler ones in a sense, we haven't seen any reasonable performance of them. So that's where we stand. Yes.
So it's kind of hard for me to see how a model like this could be anything more than just descriptional, because I'm from when I
More
was
than what? Sorry?
descriptional. Because when I was a little kid, I didn't know what past perfect was or what a noun was or whatever. I learned what the meaning of these things are in school. When I talked and when I understood language, so it was just something. It wasn't a sense that I was like running through rules in my head or assigning labels to things. That might something like that might be happening somewhere, but it's not. It's certainly not something that happens explicitly. I don't think in terms of like creating rules, grammatical rules.
Yes, but there is no assumption here that any of this is done explicitly. And as I tried to describe in the beginning, I'll talk a little bit about other works on modeling of language acquisition, but essentially the problem here is a logical problem. In a sense, we're playing in an empty field. The other team has not showed up for the game. Even those very radical assumptions on what is required in order to learn language don't give any explicit algorithm that you can implement, even in a very simplistic setting, and give any reasonable result. So it's not even clear how to use, how to incorporate assumptions of the type that are often made in linguistics into an algorithm. And what I'll show here is not only that we do offer some explicit models, it also has some appealing characteristics. Now, I agree that that it doesn't. This type of work has yet to yield any bold conjecture, if you will. So it is yet to kind of reveal to us, a world of phenomena that we haven't paid any attention to before, and now we can go and verify with humans. I hope it will, but this is not the case. But as I tried to make the point, there is some value to computational modeling at this point as well. Okay. Now, going back to combinatorial categorical grammar, yes, so what we see is that combinatorial categorical grammar is defined as follows. It's defined as a lot of lexical entries. Each of the lexical entries is a pairing between, a mapping between some phonological forms, say proof, its logical form, say proof prime or some other semantic form, and the syntactic category, which is some projection of the tree onto that word. Now, it defines how the word is going to function syntactically. So what do I mean by that? So as I said before, this strange category, what it means is that if it receives a noun phrase to its right and a noun phrase to its left, it becomes an S. So these categories define kind of restrictions on how this tree should be constructed. So the moment you have the categories of each of the words, the point is in this combinatorial categorical grammar is that essentially you know the syntactic form, pretty much. Okay, so it just transfers the question of learning from learning of these complicated trees into assigning words with these lexical categories, such as syntactic categories. Now what? Yes.
So the whole approach is not hierarchical anymore?
It is, but the constraints on the type of derivation, the type of hierarchies that are allowed, is defined in the word approach. That's what's important. So it means that essentially these are local decisions. What you have once you tell me how each of the words separately behave, then this determines the whole set of hierarchies that are possible. So it restricts the space a great deal. That's the point in here. And what I won't have much time to discuss, that's another derivation. But what I won't have much time here to discuss, but is very important, is that this theory also gives predictions. This CCG theory, combinatorial categorical grammar, gives predictions about long distance dependencies, right? So perhaps it seems that that this slide, the only thing it says is I need an NP to my right and an NP to my left. So I'm a kind of an SV over, but actually it also tells you what I mean to say is that like can also say be used in a relative clause. So for instance, this is the dog that I like. Okay. So now this like has an argument dog, which is not to its right, as this category implies. I'm looking for an object to my right, but rather it is much to its left, even in another clause. Now, but of course this is all very regular. So it's pretty clear from the fact that like behaves in this SVO way that the relative clause should look the way that it does. It's not a new rule in a sense, and this is all encoded into the CCG, into the assumptions that the CCG theory is making. So, if you will, the theory is a theory that puts all language-specific information on the lexical categories. And once you determine these categories, there is a set of rules telling you what kind of derivations you're expect to see and which ones you don't. So, as we all know from basic learning theory, restrictions facilitate learning. We have more restricted space, we have less possibilities we need to rule out. So that's the trick. Yeah, so that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make. If it's language specific, it's stored in the lexicon, and there is a set of what's not language specific, or the way that the words are allowed to combine, the way that syntactic categories are allowed to combine, is defined by this framework, which will be the topic of another lesson, not in this course probably, but that's part of the CCG theory, and this should apply to all languages. At least that's the claim of the theory. Okay. Now another thing that's important about CCG is that it has surface compositionality. What does that mean? It means that these syntactic derivations, these hierarchies, also define the way in which semantics, in which the semantic forms compose with one another. Okay, so I guess, well, without giving too technical a description, what it means is that if I know the syntactic, if I know this tree, if I know that these are the categories of the words, and this is the way that they hierarchically compose with one another, then I also know how to take the meanings of the leaves, how to take the meanings of the individual words, and to build from them meanings of larger and larger constituents until I reach the meaning of the full sentence. Okay, so this is also defined by the theory. It's called compositionality. If you yes.
Maybe from the beginning, I don't really understand how this, how things, what you see in the end, how this is useful.
We'll see in a moment.
Okay.
Yes, perhaps I've taken a bit too long for the introduction, but it's about over. So yes, that I've pretty much said. So we can just jump to the end of the background and move on to your question. And now the question is, given a set of sentence meaning pairs, what we need to do is induce the lexicon of the target language. Okay, so instead of finding the rules of grammar and the mapping between logical forms and words, which was the original problem, in CCG terms, what we need to do is to find the syntactic categories of words and to find their logical form. So we need to find the lexical items of each and every word, and that defines both the grammar and the vocabulary.
What is that?
So what I'm saying is that this theory essentially means that what we try to find is now these types of triplets, right? We need to find for each word its syntactic category and its logical form. This is what it means. This is what it means to learn grammar, to know all of these, and this is what it means to know the vocabulary. Okay? If I know these triplets, that's essentially, I know all I need to know.
Can you give an example of when you know these triplets for a new sentence and then it makes you something useful?
Okay. Yes. So for instance, if I received this string without this, you like the doggies. Okay, and now I know, or perhaps I had another one. You like the doggies. Now, if I know that this is an NP and this is an whatever, if I know this up to this line here, then the CCG theory tells me this essentially, tells me the meaning of the complete sentence.
Okay, in what way this is the meaning? What does it mean that this is the meaning of the sentence?
Well, this is we represent semantics as these kind of predicate logic formulas. So the goal of learning is to
give an example where you take the same structure and insert different things and you have something new, or
we'll see that. Ask me again in 10 minutes if I don't answer your question. Okay. Good. So this is the learning setting again, and let's see now how the model is actually defined. Okay, we have these pairs of strings and formulas, and we now want to generalize to unseen strings and to formulate and to predict what their correct formulas are. Right. That's essentially the task. So what do we model? What kind of information do we store, in a sense, or represent? So one thing we represent is the CCG grammar. Okay, so we keep the lexicon, or we'll see how we find them in a moment. But one of the things that we stored is these kind of triplets. What kind of semantic form matches like, and how its syntactic category looks like, how its syntactic behavior is. That's one thing we store. And we also store another thing, which is distribution over derivation. And we'll see how this helps us in a moment. So we also store in the distribution of these trees that we have encountered. Okay, and now let's go for an example. So we'll see how this helps us. Let's say that we receive a very simple example, more doggies matching to these simple formulas, more applied to dogs. Okay, this is all very simplified, but now what I ideally would want to know here is that this more matches more in English, and this doggies matches dogs, here this logical dogs, okay, and I would also like to know that these kind of quantifiers come before nouns in English. Okay, so these are the three things that I want to know, ideally, from this example, right? But for the time being, I only have this example. So what I can do is I have, the CCG theory, and in a way that perhaps perhaps or perhaps not, I'll talk about, I have a way of generating the space of all possible derivations, all possible hierarchical structure. Here it's a very shallow hierarchy, but still all type of hierarchical structures that give rise to this mapping between formulas and strings. Now, that I can do. What else I can do is I'm taking a Bayesian approach. Okay, so at each point I have beliefs. I have beliefs about what are the likely derivations and what are the likely pairings between words and logical forms. So that I have. In the beginning it's uniform. Okay, so say I don't know whether to prefer to analyze this more doggies as saying more means more and doggies means dogs, or that more means dogs and doggies means more, or that more doggies is just one word matching more dogs. Okay, and you can't break it into parts. It's just one fixed expression. I don't know. But I give, say, same probability to these two because they're completely symmetrical. And I don't know anything. Now, what I can do now is move on to the next example. This is all very schematic, but still, say that the next example is more kitties. Okay? Now, with more kitties, there is no symmetry anymore. Right? Why is there no symmetry? Because I've seen a point, for example, where more matches more. I also seen a point, for example, where more matches dogs, but it doesn't even enter into it because dogs don't appear here. So this is, just by assigning some small probability to more matches more. Now with the next example, I know that this is slightly more probable than this. Okay? Now the next example, say that the next example is any foxes. Okay? It's a little bit silly, but indulge me. Any foxes. Now I haven't seen any, and I haven't seen foxes. Right? None of them I've seen. But I do know, because I also keep a distribution over the derivations, so I do know that, here, an adjective before noun and noun before adjective appears with the same probability. So everything is symmetric. But here, I know that this appears with a slightly larger probability than this, so I know that there's a slightly larger probability that adjective, or here quantifiers, come before nouns. And so I can use this also with any foxes. Okay, so this is the rationale of this whole thing, how this distribution over derivations and distribution over which words correspond to which logical forms kind of interact. Okay, and that's essentially how the algorithm works. We can talk a bit. I'll go through it very briefly. There's some mathematics behind it. But you can think about it as very simply as essentially what I've said. You're given a training sample. You generate a space of all possible ways allowed by the CCG theory in which this logical form can emerge from this, can be mapped to this phonological sequence from the string. Now you update, you weight them according to your current beliefs, then you update your beliefs based on this set of this set of training instances that are partly hallucinated. You've never actually seen these three, but you kind of look at the entire space. So in some way you have seen them, and then you go on to the next example. Yes.
Quick question. So you get like surface form and mathematical representation, logical forms.
We get a string that the most conforming.
So you use them to correct your current representations, like current
So
algorithm.
I have my current belief. Well, forget about my beliefs here. I have this pair. I can look at all
Yeah.
possible ways in which this, all possible derivations that link between the two,
Okay.
and then I have beliefs. For instance, that adjectives come before nouns, or that English is an SVO language and not a BSO language. So I have these beliefs, and now I can weight this space according to these beliefs. Okay, so for instance, the rich get richer, right? And then I update my beliefs again and move on to the next example.
And of course, how do you get your initial belief?
It's uniform over symmetrical options. So that's very standard in Bayesian approaches.
But how do you ever? I mean, so you have three possible.
How do I break the symmetry? Well, that's that's how I essentially I first have to break the symmetry because some words recur in multiple sentences. This breaks the symmetry a bit, but now since this breaks the symmetry a bit, also this leads to asymmetrical distribution over derivations. So now they're skewed, but and
Lexical and then like just
yes. So now, okay. From a Bayesian modeling point of view, and perhaps I'll just skip through that very briefly. You can also think of this algorithm. I won't say too much about it, but I'll be glad to talk with any of you if you're interested later on. Behind this, there is actually a kind of more sophisticated, if you will, approach, which is a Bayesian approach. So essentially, what this model does is not what I've told you. This is kind of the outcome, but rather we define a probabilistic model that relates strings and logical forms, and this algorithm is just a way to maximize some statistical notion given this model. Okay, so this algorithm is actually a consequence rather than just some algorithm that we came up with. So the way that to perhaps correctly think about this model is as some probability distribution defined over triplets of sentence, meanings, and derivations, where the sentences and the meaning of the entire thing, the sentential meaning, not the meaning of the word, are observed in the training data. The derivations are what's called latent. They're latent variables. They're never observed, but through the assumptions on the relations between the sentences, meanings, and derivations, we can infer what those derivations are. And once you find the probabilistic model, essentially what you do is just find the parameters that best account for the data. Okay, so there's a principled way of doing it defined by the principles of Bayesian learning. Perhaps you've seen a little of that in the paper for this week. And this is what's done here as well. What's slightly different, I think, from a lot of Bayesian learning approaches is that this algorithm is online. So it receives one example at a time, rather than receiving all of the data and then what's called batch learning, receiving all of the data and then finding the best generalization. But other than that, it's based on the principles of Bayesian learning. And there's some interesting things here, but I don't know. Are you interested in this kind of? Do you have background in Bayesian modeling, and this is something that's learned in the basic courses of the program, or is it? Well, I'd be glad to discuss this later. There are some interesting things around it, and what's important is that it's a very principled way of doing things. It's very clear what the assumptions are. You define the model. Then once you have the model, there are standard ways of devising the algorithm from it. Yes.
So for this one, when you're generating all these possibilities, so you do still have to start with some sort of assumption about what the possible paths are.
question, and I guess, but answering it would take me too far afield. Essentially, the way that we define this model has, it has an attractive property that you can apply dynamic programming if you are acquainted with this notion. So essentially, it allows you to sum over an exponential number of instances in polynomial time because of the structure of the problem. But I think it would get too technical if I'll go into that. So perhaps
Do you
that's
think it's
later.
biologically possible that you're actually generating every possible?
Well, it's not. It's a kind of a way of explaining it. It's not that the algorithm does something equivalent to that, but does not sum over an exponential number of options, which of course would be prohibitively difficult computation. Yes. Well, I won't go over the model. Perhaps I will. No, I won't go over this generating the space of possible derivations. This is all quite interesting, I think, for those of you interested in linguistics or in Bayesian learning theory. But as I said, I'd be glad to discuss. I want to move on to the experiment, so we'll have enough time. Okay, so we conducted some experiments on the child-directed speech, on child-directed utterances from the English Eve corpus. We took transcripts of we took transcripts of 20 sessions that were taken between ages of 18 and 27 months with a single child. We have very few utterances, and the reason for that is that we need this pairing between sentences and logical forms, and it's very difficult to get logical forms. So there are perhaps other ways of obtaining them, but for the time being, experiments are quite limited. So only a fraction actually of what's available to the child, 5,000 utterances. Yes, so the semantics is very simple. It's very English-centric, but I will talk about that in a minute. But still, it abstracts away from the order of the words and the way in which they are decomposed. So I do entertain the possibility that one word accounts for for the entire meaning, and that is, say, does nothing. Okay. I also introduced some noise into the model, so I pair each sentence also with a set of distractors. So I don't have sentence meaning pairs, but rather sentence paired with a set of possible logical forms, only one of which is correct, and the other are kind of contextually plausible but incorrect. Okay, just to add some noise to see the robustness. And we see that the model, the absolute accuracy is perhaps not very high. This is the accuracy of the model over a test set, a held-out test set, but it does increase with time, and it is fairly robust to noise. Low noise is adding 2 distractors, and high noise is adding 6 distractors. And yes, the accuracy is probably due, well, at least possibly due to the small size of the training set. But all in all, it at least shows that this approach is feasible, and that this model captures at least quite a bit of the correct generalization.
Accuracy in the mapping from the...
Accurately predicting the formula. Okay, so I want to know that I got the same formula as that was annotated by, say, a human.
You are not testing it by giving it a new sentence, never...
Yes, that's what I'm doing.
Are testing?
Yes.
On the left side.
A held-out test set. So we have a separate set of sentences which we hold out. They're not included as part of the training data.
No, what I meant was, I thought what you told us a bit was that you just tested, like, for each word, whether the vocabulary lexic, I don't remember the term, was correctly learned, or whether you looked at this and saw, I guess it's kind of straightforward from there, but...
Yeah, so it's...
Do you test it by checking how percent correct of
Yes.
vocabulary
No.
or percent correct of new sentences?
Yes, prediction accuracy of on a nonsense sentence.
Okay.
Now, we also looked, this is just one example, we also looked at the generalizations that the model makes. So for instance, whether it's a subject-verb-object that the model learns, or that it's a verb initial, or whether it makes the generalization that it's verb initial or an object-verb-subject, and we see that, that indeed the subject-verb-object is the one that the model assigns most belief to. We also see that in terms of individual verbs, first, there are a lot of kind of these stepwise behavior, right? So things can go up and down quite sharply, which is something that at least it's just good to know that these kind of statistical models can show these abrupt learning over one shot learning or two shot learning, because sometimes statistical models are accused of not being able to show this behavior. This is just important to bear in mind. And it's also important to bear in mind that that verbs that were learned early, that the model was exposed to early on, say here, were learned at the beginning to a lower accuracy than those that were learned that have appeared later on. And the idea here is that, well, perhaps here with the verb fit, when it was first encountered, the verb had very little understanding of the grammar of the language, so it was pretty difficult to learn it. And then with verbs that appear later on, the model knew more. We actually can also see that in another graph by aggregating frequent verbs and infrequent verbs. So this is, say, the probability. This is some notion of the probability that of the correct that the correct category was learned. You see that for infrequent verbs, they were learned at the first time that they've been seen to a 0.3 and then 0.5, 0.6 accuracy. So this is fairly steep. For the frequent ones, it's not as steep as that. And the reason for that is, well, it's another way of seeing what we've seen before. It's because the frequent verbs would tend, on average, to show up more towards the beginning, right? So in a sense, this graph is spread over a shorter amount of time, closer to the beginning, and this graph is spread over a wider span of time, and more towards spanned over more of the learning. So this is again kind of shows you that the model gets better with time at understanding what new verbs are. Yes, let's not talk too much about that. Perhaps the last thing in terms of results, see that I'm really bad with time, huh? So I have still 3:20. Okay. Yes. The syntactic bootstrapping effect is an effect that's been recorded in the literature quite a bit. It's essentially, simplistically saying what it means is that previously established constructions or generalizations help with the learning of unknown words. Okay? So for instance, it has experiments such as, showing people two pictures and saying one of them corresponds to the girl is gorping the boy and the other one is the boy is gorping the girl, and you should decide which is which without knowing what gorping means, because it's a nonsense word, and obviously people have preference towards saying that the agent is this here the girl is first and here the boy is first. Okay. Now, and this has also been exemplified in children, and the question is whether our model can also make these kind of predictions, whether a model, even when given nonsense verbs or unseen verbs, can also understand that, can also relate the semantic roles correctly with the syntactic roles, and this is also something that's captured by this model. So for instance, if we give it something like Jackie Gorp Jacob, even if it doesn't know that what Jackie and Jacob mean, it would still, because it has learned the generalization that this is an SVO language, would still prefer saying that that Gorp is such that that Gorp is the verb here rather than any of the other two, and then its first position matches matches the first word of the sentence, and its second position matches the second. So this also emerges in a natural way from just keeping distribution over the derivations. Okay, if I know that SVOs is, if I know that the language is SVO, if I know that in general how the syntactic derivations of this language look like, that I can also apply them to unseen verbs, and and get this kind of syntactic bootstrapping effect, as the graph also shows. So it reaches my secular point. Was that clear, this part? Yes.
It's not, that question is, it's that, can't you use that and add to that the statistical, the phonetic, the statistics of the phonetics, like Gork specifically the end of ED and add it in and like, couldn't it like improve it much more? Why is it two different, approaches?
You're right. We haven't touched morphology, and it's an important bit. Perhaps in English we've gotten away with it, but we're working on introducing this kind of information as well into the model, because it's pretty clear that the model also makes these kind of generalizations. It was just not modeled here. Okay. So to conclude with a short discussion about the parameter setting approaches. Yes. Not sure. Okay, yeah, that's the important bit that I want to discuss. About semantic representation, also relating to Marat, to your question from the beginning, why do we even want to learn this kind of mapping between these English-centric logical forms that look very similar to English and strings in English? It doesn't look that interesting. What we would actually want to do is get a semantic representation that's more realistic in terms of what we assume that the child may have access to, or at least an ideal child. So the first desideratum would be that the semantic representation would express distinctions that can be, all distinctions. So this kind of semantic representations won't be tailored to English, but rather be something that can work more broadly. And this can actually be done. We can improve on the semantic representation that we use, and this was essentially a large part of my PhD, using both typological theory, for instance, the works of R&W Dixon, if you know them, and distributional methods in order to create a semantic representation that's cross-linguistically valid. And this again, something I'd be glad to discuss. This is ongoing work. So for instance, this is just one example. I can see that if I have a parallel corpus, and I see that in English prepared sometimes translated to a Khanti, have prepared sometimes translated to a Khanti, and prepared translated to a Khanti, then I can somehow infer that there is some distinction between those two, expressed in English, not expressed in Hebrew, and then perhaps I can build a representation that represents all these relevant distinctions, and also other methods. So this is something that we're working on, but perhaps more interestingly, I don't have a slide for it, the end point of this would be to use information which is not even linguistic. So it would, this line of work goes towards a semantic representation that say represents things like what kind of objects say exist in the room, to represent perhaps visual features that would be nice. So semantic representation, you can think about it as any, it's a pretty general setting, so the CCG doesn't restrict you into having these kind of logical forms. It could essentially be anything you can express as a logical formula. It could also have, say, visual features or features that emerge from, say, shared attention, and there are some attempts to try and formalize that. So I think this is certainly, or information structural distinctions, say, for instance, whether something has just been introduced into the discourse or introduced into the event. So we can try and match that with grammatical generalizations. So you can think of a much richer semantic representation that incorporates not only linguistic information per se, but something much broader. And that is much of the motivation here. Yes, so the formal apparatus would essentially work the same. So just to conclude, I presented a joint model of word and grammar learning, and although it shares some similarity with previous approaches. The notion of the grammar that we use is not that of a principles and parameters, defining some set of parameters that we have to put on, switches that we have to put on and off, but rather defining a space of all possible hierarchical structure under some wide definition, an infinite space of derivations, and defines an algorithm and an inference algorithm for searching the space and learning a mapping between text and logical forms. We have seen that the algorithm is plausible in the sense that it does achieve reasonable accuracy, it is robust to noise, and it displays certain phenomena that mirror developmental trends in children, such as I talked about syntactic bootstrapping. There's also other things such as the vocabulary spurt. So I'd be glad to discuss that later on. But and finally, I've discussed or tried to advocate this setting as an attractive test bed for looking at the interplay between these different components that enable learning in children, which are the type of input available to the learner, or the way that we represent it, the statistical modeling assumptions, and the formal constraints over the grammar. All of these can be, I think, within this framework, all of these have a place and can be manipulated, largely keeping the same algorithmic framework. So I think it is interesting to explore. And specifically, we're looking at additional grammatical phenomena such as morphology that you have also asked me about, and more realistic semantic representation, as I've alluded to as well. So thank you very much. As I've said, I'd be glad to discuss any of these pointers that I've left through the presentation, and in general would be glad to discuss things related to computation linguistics or natural language processing. Thank you. Oh, yes.
The Hebrew University.
Sorry. Yes. I should have added that too.
I just didn't understand the usefulness of this mapping, or why do we need to know that, but I believe you that it's useful.
No, it's not a very complicated point. Perhaps I should reiterate.
Let me
it's
show
yes.
you or tell you how you can demonstrate this for people like me that don't understand. For example, two slides, your algorithm could be presented with a sentence, an English sentence, and tell me whether it is valid or not, for example.
Well, validity, it's a question of what validity means. Validity is
Let's
very
say a user took, wrote down 200 valid sentences, 200 invalid, incorrect sentences in English.
Incorrect in what sense? Like grammatically?
Grammatical, yes.
This is a slightly different question, and a very ill-defined one. That's the. No, I'm not saying that as a critique of you. I'm saying it as as kind of a general theoretical point. But
just a way to demonstrate that it's interesting for people like me that don't understand initially why are we doing this. It's this kind of task. Another kind of task is if I can give you two sentences and you can tell me whether they are similar in meaning.
okay, yeah. So that's exactly this type of machinery is also used exactly for these things. So for looking, for instance, question answering, from a database, you type in a natural language query and you want to map it into a database query that's another formal language, right? The formal language of database query, and then pull out from some large database the answer. What is the second largest state bordering Texas? So you can go in and write an SQL query that would pull out the correct one. So this kind of machinery is also used there. But here, what we've tried to do is to model, to think about the linkage problem in language acquisition as also this type of semantic parsing, of this glossing of strings in terms of logical forms.
The only thing I'm trying to say is that this semantic parsing has some importance.
understanding, automatic language understanding is certainly related to these talks in terms of techniques. I've taken, well, you know, because of the theme of the course and also because this also represents a theme in my work, I've taken kind of a cognitive modeling approach, but the machinery is the same. I've tried to, perhaps I was less convincing in that than I would have been, you know, had I given an NLP, a natural language processing talk. But still I try to make the claim that these kind of arguments also have some value for linguistic theory. You know, in terms of, for instance, spelling out an explicit algorithm for jointly learning the meaning of the words and the grammar in a way that, you know, has advantages to the learning of each, and also a way to integrate into it kind of general assumptions on the structure of grammar. You know, so I use combinatory categorical grammar, but it could have used another. So try to describe some framework that I think could be of value, but I mean, there's certainly a lot to be said to criticize it. I'm not, you know.
I'm not about criticizing.
Okay.
Just because I didn't understand the value, I want at least people
Okay.
to understand.
Okay.
So me, by the way, going on, it's the difficult, I mean, in terms of the broader context of the course, it's kind of the first presentation of using Bayesian approaches for learning. Particularly challenging is probably the issue of, in a way, bootstrapping. So how do children start acquiring information? Because for me, the whole Bayesian approach is as if they assume less. I'm not sure they don't, it's as if they including you, assume less, but I'm not sure they don't assume more, because there are two very strong assumptions in the way that you make. And the question there, my question is whether you think it's a plausible way of understanding real children's language acquisition. So one issue is how useful and how efficient in terms of an algorithm, and the other, do you seriously think it's a cognitively plausible conceptualization? And in a cognitive perspective, which is kind of the relevant context for our course, the two issues. One is like the semantic, the innate, in a way, semantic level of representation that I asked you. But the other thing, which will be shared, I think, by all subsequent Bayesian inferences that we are going to present, is like, we have it all somewhere. We keep all our encounters with the distributions of the figure words and relations between words, and we have it in syntax and whatever the paper that you are, we'll see when, going to present. But there's a very strong assumption that somehow we have it. Well, you know, our long-term memory, as we have seen, is very broad, but does it really include every experience to a level that we can afterwards update? Because you have all these representations that you have encountered, and now you update them, and all these things that nothing gets lost in a way. There's a very strong assumption.
Well, but it's not that nothing is lost. So I haven't. There are two things that this model stores. One of them I've kind of talked about more explicitly, and this is kind of the pairing between, or these triplets, right, of words, what their meaning is and what their syntactic behavior is, which in a way I don't see any way around it, because, well, you know, at least you'd have to keep, certainly you have to keep all the words and what their meaning is, because I don't, you know, there isn't a lot of regularity there. And so you have to keep your vocabulary.
You have all these words, you don't know what they mean, you don't know their lexical, the exact function, their grammatical function, but you keep them, right? You store them somehow.
Okay,
And
so
they're there.
what you're saying is that I keep a lot of kind of spurious analyses that I've made along the way, but have later. So, for instance, I also keep the evidence that I have for the saying that like is a VSO verb rather than an SVO, and
I mean, information. We, like Eva and I, worked on acquisition of new words, and we are terrible in acquiring new words. I mean, you assume that we acquire all this information, we keep it, even before we know much about it, but we still have this very detailed representation of all these things. And this gets us to long-term memory, and what are the experiences, what is the level of store it, because afterwards you update its meaning, its grammatical meaning. So it's there stored in your long-term memory, maybe with three alternatives, and you keep it, even though you don't understand it, and you kind of have this huge retention for vocabulary before you got what it means.
Okay, so I do.
Of course you do, though.
What?
Of course you do, though, because you know what words are. So I have a very large vocabulary of thousands of words. That's what I have.
Yeah, but you have
Of course.
whatever, now you're going to be in a Chinese, you're going to go to China. You're going to be exposed to huge number of words. And they're going to be stored in your memory even before you understand their grammatical and lexical meaning. And afterwards you keep updating what's going on. So that's the idea. It's not that, okay, you store, it's like you are in a room, you don't understand anything, and you store all the words that are said there, and gradually you update your representation of what they mean. This is what they mean. It's not just having the large vocabulary you very gradually acquire. I mean, the alternative is, let's say, child spoken language, is that you have, you acquire once you understand, or very, very slowly. So first you have Abba, Ima, Bamba, I don't know, and then you gradually, based on this small brain, enhance your vocabulary. But this is not what you assume. This is not what you assume.
Right. So I don't assume.
All these things you have encountered, and then you attribute some grammatical function to them.
Yes. So, okay, we certainly don't introduce any assumptions about memory here, which
You
could.
don't introduce, of course you do.
No, what I'm saying is on the limited. Yes, that's what I meant.
This is a strong assumption. There's no limit
No, but
to memorizing what you've encountered.
sure, but we looked. There is also always a question of what are the boundaries of what you're planning, what you're modeling, because otherwise it's very hard to get some consequences. Now, it would be interesting to think of in what way we could put in some, constraints, say, on forgetting things that have not been learned. We're not doing. I should also say that we're not actually. This model is not really a model of word learning, in the sense of. It's a model of linkage, of learning, say, a linkage between some concept that you have and the word. So this model also, perhaps even a stronger critique could be made that, for learning words, we assume that they're already known, we just don't know how to say them, right? We know the concepts, we still have to look, which is also a bit silly. That's why I've tried to kind of position this model within the larger literature of saying that the larger literature in linguistics, which is lacking in models for this setting, for this learning setting. So there is some work on word learning. There is no. This is really uncharted territory. So that's why we kind of refrained from delving into these very deep and interesting questions, which I fully agree that we do not model.
I apologize for doing it now, but I think it will be relevant for all subsequent stuff with better learning. They all assume all this, and it will be related to. Is that okay for you to present first next week?
Sure, ours is only half an hour. You can do it.
Half an hour?
Joking.
I mean, it's always an issue of like taking more time and sort of understanding better what you said. So it was important to me to say this when I can have a dispute with somebody rather than because so it will be relevant to next week. So we're going to take a break in 2 minutes. Not a break. I think we're going to finish. Don't worry. In 2 minutes. But it is important to me because next week we're going to have another presentation. It's not in work, so you don't have responsibility for the assumptions, but it's a paper proposed by Louise too, but it's a different thing. It's about Bayesian model for how we can deduce that language is represented hierarchically, even if we don't assume so, just by being exposed to all these sentences, that we keep them and then analyze them. So for me, this is just one example. We'll have more. It's kind of, and the reason I elaborate on it is because it's a very, very fashionable, I could say sophisticated and maybe successful to some extent, assumption about how we learn, that all of these Bayesian algorithms, but they all assume that we have this representation of things we have not yet understood, we have been exposed to, and we keep them. And then we analyze and do all sorts of updates on them. And I wonder to what extent they are cognitively feasible in terms of how we acquire new information, and whether we can store information effectively if it doesn't mean anything to us.
Yes, perhaps I should say that language, I think that theoretical linguistics have what I'm trying to say is that I don't think that this kind of assumptions is something unique to Bayesian learning. So this kind of more information theoretic or logical approach to linguistic questions is something which you find much before that, for instance, in the generative tradition, but also in others. So, but I mean, I agree with you, but I think this is perhaps, at least in terms of language, study of language, this is even a broader issue.
So the other thing is just wanted to put in context the issue of whether all these computational views take into account limits on our memory of encounters, etc. And this will be relevant, I think, to your paper as well, but to other kind of cases of Bayesian inference. Keep in mind, it's never out there. It's never out there in the paper. But this is a very, very strong assumption. And it's always there. That you can have access to all the Bayesian encounters and then reinterpret them and then update, because you have access to these huge corpora that are now in your mind. And they are there just because you've accessed them at some point, even though you didn't know how to interpret them.
There are
You agree with that?
Well,
Strong case.
they're there, but they're there in, there's some cases in which they're there in the sense that you actually have access to everything you've ever encountered.
Right.
In this, for instance, in the model that I've presented, it's not as strong as that. I don't remember complete sentences. I don't remember words. And you're right, I also remember words that I don't really know what they mean, but I kind of still entertain 10 possibilities from them. And I do.
To give you 10 words today and ask you them next week, and then bet you will know none of them.
I don't understand. Why is there
Tell me words, tell me
initial
fake
time?
words. What?
Like, if he doesn't do it over time like that, if he does it, he introduces the words and after whatever, short, like, there wasn't time in the model. Like, I didn't see the
That's the point, they don't say it. But of course, how could he update? The way he learned, okay, this is why I wanted to put it on the surface, they don't. How did he learn that more foxes and more cats and more and more and more? Because he learned more foxes, more cats, more doggies, and somewhere it was stored, these phrases. Even before he knew what foxes are, what more is.
If there was limit on the time between the first time you learned and the amount of repetitions, and if I heard
No.
it enough in a short amount of time, you know, like
It's not there.
it's not that I'm saying, but like, you're saying
the
that that's
brain. Another question is what's left, etc. All I'm saying is that there's no cognitive constraint on the things you can remember just by being exposed. And it's not there. It was important for me to put it there because on the one hand it's presented as a cognitive solution, but it doesn't take into account the cognitive constraints. And I will not do it to you, but I bet that had I been telling you like now, presenting you with 10 new words, made up words you're not familiar with, and answer them at the beginning of next week, you will not be able. Now the question is to alternative false choice, maybe, but that's not what you need. You need actual recall for these, right? You need actual recall. Nobody is presenting the alternative. The alternative is sufficiently there, explicitly, that you can access them and recall. Difficult. And to alternative false choice is to just integrate what they've done. To alternative false choice we're pretty good at least when it's visual. But when you just have to play the things that are there, it's interesting. I just want to surface it that it's a very, very strong assumption. And
Yes.
it's true to all Bayesian models.
Yes, but perhaps I should just add a comment, because there is one distinction that should also pay note to, that many of the models have infinite memory in a strong